So I've been thinking with Bruce Damer and he and Dave Deemer and others hypothesis they call the hot spring hypothesis for the origins of life. I've been thinking with it philosophically, so I'm um, not myself a scientist. And when I engage with the hypotheses of scientists, what I'm really doing is trying to amplify their philosophical significance as I understand it. And so, as Bruce Damer describes this hypothesis for the origins of life or abiogenesis, he's he's saying that he's searching for Darwin's engine, because Darwin, in a letter, described this warm little pond where protein compounds would have somehow found a way to complexify, right? To molecules would have found a way, molecular structures would have found a way to lift themselves up, um, to disobey the thermodynamic equilibrium, and in a way ignite, right? Giving rise to life, to living organization. And so, from Bruce's point of view and Darwin's point of view, there's this, and, Darwin didn't have an alternative to this. There was a Newtonian physics, which said that the non-living world, which was most of the universe, is running down, right? It's a closed causal system, deterministic, obeying fixed laws, right? And in such a universe, a Newtonian clockwork universe, and actually we shouldn't even call it Newtonian because, Newton had all sorts of occult understandings and esoteric ideas, like that space was the sensorium of God, for example. And so, maybe we shouldn't call this clockwork universe Newtonian, but this mechanistic world, from Darwin's point of view, wasn't capable of novelty, and yet the living world somehow emerged out of it, right? A tendency toward complexity and toward differentiation somehow arose out of the sea of sameness, right? Of mere repetition of the same. And so life is this break, this bifurcation that leaps out of physics into, at least classical physics, into some other domain of improbable connection and improbable anticipation, right? As a result of memory. I think, Bruce Damer describes the lipid world hypothesis of his colleague David Deemer as this collaborative effort where, protocells in niche constructing communities gave rise to, and in fact themselves are the emergence of what we call life. And so it wasn't a single heroic cell that achieved so-called life, right? The progenitor was not an individual competitor. It was a consortium of protocells who were sharing the chemical tricks that they had learned with one another. And so through this network effect, catapulting themselves into far from equilibrium thermodynamic organizational stacks. And so, I think there's something to be said for the novelty achieved by the first biological organisms. But, from my point of view, we don't live in a Newtonian, there I go again, we don't live in a mechanistic universe anymore. Physics has moved on, right? We have to somehow consider the question of the origin of life from a quantum and relativistic context. rather than a classical context. And that changes everything, really. Because if you can't artificially separate the physical from the biological, from the psychological, from the spiritual, then the emergence of life becomes, yes, the achievement of a sort of higher octave of organization, but it was already implicit in the physical. And so, the question of biogenesis is nested inside these other genesises, right? And so the creation or creativity itself is, I guess at the most metaphysical level, you're talking about the creation of order, right? Cosmogenesis, the Big Bang, if you want. And then you're talking about physiogenesis, right? Where this pure potential energy congeals into, initially this sort of fuzzy plasma, and then congeals further into discrete particles, which then congeal further into heavier elements, at least hydrogen and helium initially, right? So physiogenesis in the first few 100,000 years, let's say, in the inflationary model. And then you get astrogenesis as these particles congeal even further to form stars and galaxies. These are achievements of organizational capacity in the history of the universe. These are, examples of major evolutionary leaps, right? Major evolutionary transitions way before life emerges. And after astrogenesis, then there's heavier elements, right? After a second generation or third generation of stars, there's chemogenesis, right? Because there are heavier elements. And then chemogenesis leads to biogenesis, right? Which is, again, a huge leap, but not the first example of a leap in the evolutionary history of the universe. And then the noosphere, or noogenesis, the emergence of mind and consciousness. This isn't just a sharp break from what has come before, right? It is the inner spirit of everything that has come before, come to full flower and expression, right? And so whatever mind is, it is the full flowering of matter. And so there never could have been a matter that wasn't seeded with mind, right? That wasn't pregnant with mind. And so, what Bruce Damer calls the field, this synchronistic field that is, he thinks, emerging with the advance of life and the emergence of a human community, a planetary noosphere in Teilhard de Chardin's sense. What he calls the field, I'm wanting to describe in terms of a world soul, and that this soul has been evolving with the world from the moment of Genesis through cosmogenesis and physiogenesis and astrogenesis and chemogenesis and biogenesis and noogenesis. That there's been a spirit implicit from the beginning that is gradually unfolding. And so, I think my role as a philosopher in trying to think with a scientist like Bruce or David Deamer or whoever is, trying to put the special and revealing knowledge of this hot spring hypothesis and theory, hopefully as more data and experiment confirms it, that this will clarify our understanding of this particular example of emergent evolution in the history of the cosmos. But there are many such examples that precede life, or the biological world. And so, this is why I find it important to talk about panpsychism, right? To say that there is a soul of the world is to be a panpsychist, and to say that there is not just matter spread indiscriminately in space, right? There is also animation. There is aim. The universe has been anticipating its future from the very beginning.